Dust in the archive always settled the same way, drifting down through the single shaft of light that fell from the high window, and Elowen had long since stopped noticing it. She knelt before a chest of broken relics pulled from the lowest vault, a chest that had not been opened in 3 decades, and she worked with the patience of someone who had learned that patience was the only thing the world had ever given her freely. Her fingers, calloused from years of thread and metal polish, moved carefully over a torn banner, bearing a crest no one in the palace above could name anymore. She did not mind the silence down here. She did not mind being forgotten. Being forgotten had kept her safe since the day her parents died in the border fever, and left her to the cold charity of the Royal Orphan House, a charity that fed her and clothed her, and never once asked her name unless it was time to assign her another task. She catalogued. She mended. She existed in the margins of a kingdom that had no room for her in its center. And she told herself, as she told herself every night, that this was enough. That night, beneath a layer of moth-eaten cloth, her hand closed around something cold and heavy, and when she pulled it free, she found half of a crown, its metal blackened, its edges jagged where it had been broken centuries ago, in some war whose name had been scrubbed from every record she had ever touched. She should have set it aside. She should have logged it and moved on to the next crate. Instead, she held it, and the moment her fingers pressed against the tarnished band, the window above her shattered open with a gust of wind that carried no rain, and a white falcon, larger than any bird she had ever seen, dropped through the opening and landed on the stone floor before her. Its eyes gold and unblinking, fixed only on her. Elowen did not move. She had heard the old stories, the ones the archive keepers whispered when they thought no one was listening. Stories of a falcon that once circled only the heads of true kings. A falcon that had not been seen since the last of the ancient bloodline vanished from the world. She told herself it was a trick of exhaustion, a trick of candlelight, until the bird lowered its head toward the broken crown in her hands and let out a cry that echoed up through every corridor of the palace above. If you are enjoying this story so far, do not forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new story like this one. By the time the guards reached the archive, summoned by a sound none of them could explain, Elowen was still kneeling on the floor, the crown clutched to her chest. The falcon perched motionless on the crate beside her, as though it had chosen to stay. King Cassian arrived not because a servant girl had made a noise in the cellars, but because his own guards, hardened men who feared very little, refused to enter the archive alone. He stood in the doorway, tall in the plain dark coat he preferred over ceremonial armor, and studied the scene with the flat, assessing calm that had made him a ruler. Even his rivals respected before they resented him. He did not believe in omens. He believed in treaties, in supply lines, in the slow, unglamorous work of holding a fractured kingdom together, after his father's reign had nearly torn it apart. But he had also been raised on the old law, the one carved into the foundation stone of the throne room, the law that said the crown of the first kings would answer only to blood that carried their gift, and no crown had answered to anyone in his lifetime. He crossed the room and crouched before Elowen, close enough to see that her hands were shaking, and asked her name. She gave it quietly, the way she gave everything, as though she expected to be told it did not matter. The falcon shifted its weight and turned its gold eyes toward him, and for the first time since his coronation, Cassian felt something in his chest that was not quite fear and not quite hope, but sat uncomfortably between the two. He ordered the crown taken to the royal physician for study, and Elowen brought to the upper halls for questioning, a decision that unsettled her more than the falcon ever could, because the upper halls were not built for women like her. She walked corridors lined with portraits of kings who had never known her name, past nobles who paused their conversations to stare, and she felt every year of her invisibility collapse into a single unbearable moment of being seen. Lady Isadora, the king's cousin and the sharpest mind on his council, watched the girl pass from the shadow of a pillar with an expression that gave away nothing. Isadora had spent 15 years building the fragile peace that held the kingdom's noble houses together after the war that broke the old crown in the first place. Trading favors, arranging marriages, quietly burying old claims that might have reignited the conflict. And she had done it all so the throne would never again be threatened by a bloodline no one could control. She did not hate the archivist. She did not even fear her, not yet. But she recognized, the way only someone who had spent a lifetime reading rooms could recognize, that the Falcon's arrival was not an accident, and that accidents were the only thing Isadora had never learned to manage. The physician's examination confirmed what the old law had predicted, and what Cassian had hoped. Quietly, and against his own better judgment, would prove false. The crown, when placed near Eloan's skin, warmed faintly, the tarnish along its broken edge beginning to lift as though the metal itself remembered something her blood had reminded it of. The royal historian, an old woman named Old Marta, who had outlived 3 reigns and trusted almost no one in the palace, confirmed that the last recorded bearer of the Falcon's mark had vanished during the same war that split the crown. A lesser noblewoman rumored to have fled south with an infant daughter, rather than see that child used as a political prize. Cassian sat with this information for a long while in his private study, turning it over the way he turned over every difficult truth. And when he finally summoned Eloan there, he did not treat her as a threat or a curiosity. He asked her plainly whether she wanted this. She laughed, a short, surprised sound, because no one had ever asked her what she wanted about anything, and she told him honestly that she did not know, that she had spent her whole life being told what she was allowed to want, and had never practiced wanting anything larger. Cassian, who had spent his own life being told what a king was allowed to feel, found he understood that answer better than he expected to. What do you think happens next? Leave your predictions in the comments below. I always love reading them before the big reveals. The days that followed pulled Eloan slowly out of the archive and into a world that did not know what to do with her. Cassian assigned her rooms near the eastern wing, modest by palace standards but grander than anything she had known. And he insisted over the objections of several older lords that she be taught the histories of the court so she would not be blindsided by its currents. It was Isadora, surprisingly, who offered to tutor her, a decision that unsettled Cassian more than he let on, though he told himself his cousin was simply protecting her own position by staying close to the threat. Isadora was, in her own careful way, generous with her lessons, teaching Eloan which lords could be trusted and which could not, how to hold a room's attention without raising her voice, how to recognize the difference between a compliment and a trap. Eloan began to suspect, though she could not prove it, that Isadora was also studying her in return, cataloging her weaknesses the way Eloan herself had once cataloged broken relics. She did not resent it. She understood better than most what it meant to survive by making yourself useful to people more powerful than you. Her bond with Cassian deepened in smaller, quieter moments than either of them expected. He found her in the gardens at dawn, unable to sleep, and instead of dismissing her, he sat beside her on the cold stone bench and talked about his father's failures until the sun came up. She found him in the map room late one night, exhausted by a border dispute that threatened to unravel the fragile peace his cousin had spent years building, and she listened without offering advice she had no right to give, simply sitting with him until the weight on his shoulders eased. Neither of them named what was growing between them. He was a king bound by duty to consider alliances that would strengthen the crown politically, and she was a woman who had learned that wanting things led only to losing them. But the falcon began appearing at her window each morning now, and the broken crown, kept in a locked case in the royal vault, was said by the guards to hum faintly whenever Cassian walked past it, as though it recognized a nearness it had been waiting centuries to feel. It was Isadora who first suggested, in open council, that the girl's claim be tested formally at the recognition ceremony held every generation to confirm a bloodline's right to the old power. She framed it as protection, arguing that a quiet, undocumented claim left the kingdom vulnerable to accusations of fraud or manipulation from rival houses, and that only a public trial before the full court could settle the matter beyond doubt. Cassian suspected correctly that his cousin had a second reason, one she did not speak aloud, which was that a public failure would end the matter cleanly, while a private acknowledgement would leave the question forever open to challenge. He agreed to the ceremony anyway, because he could see no honest way to refuse it. and because some quiet part of him wanted to know once and for all whether the Falcon's judgment could be trusted. The weeks before the ceremony tested Alawen in ways the archive never had. Rumors spread through the court that she was a fraud planted by a rival house, that she had somehow tricked the Falcon with old blood magic, that she was an ambitious servant grasping for a crown that was never meant for her. She endured whispered insults in hallways she had once walked unseen, and she began to understand that being seen carried its own cruelty, one she had never had to face in her years of invisibility. Cassian defended her publicly whenever the accusations grew loud enough to reach him, but he could not follow her into every corridor, and there were nights she returned to her rooms and wept quietly into a pillow that had never known her tears before, wondering whether the archive had not been kinder to her after all. It was Isadora, unexpectedly, who found her in one such moment, and instead of the cold political creature Elowen had learned to expect, she found a woman who sat down beside her without ceremony and admitted, in a low voice, that she remembered what it felt like to be young and disbelieved. Before her family's name had earned her any authority at all, she told Elowen that the court's cruelty was rarely about the person it targeted, and almost always about the fear underneath it, the fear of a world reordering itself faster than the powerful could control. It was not quite an apology, and it was not quite an alliance, but it was the first honest thing Isadora had offered her, and Elowen carried it with her into the final days before the ceremony, like a small, unexpected gift. If you want to see how this story ends, make sure you are subscribed with your notifications turned on, because the ceremony is where everything changes. The recognition ceremony was held at dusk, in the old stone courtyard beneath the ruined half of the original throne room, a space left deliberately unrepaired since the war, so the kingdom would never forget what division cost. The full court gathered in circles around the ancient dais, lords and ladies and soldiers, and for the first time in decades, servants and archive keepers permitted to stand at the edges and witness. Elowen stood at the center in a plain gray gown she had chosen herself, refusing the ornate robes offered by the royal tailors, because she wanted to face this moment as exactly who she was, an archivist who had spent her life in service to forgotten things. The broken crown was brought forward on a velvet cushion, its jagged edge catching the last light of the sun, and old Marta read aloud the ancient words of the trial, words that had not been spoken in 100 years, calling on the bloodline of the Falcon Kings to answer if it remained in the world. Elowen lifted the crown with both hands, and for one unbearable moment nothing happened at all, and she felt the entire court's held breath press against her like a physical weight. Then the metal grew warm beneath her palms, the tarnish lifting away in slow curling flakes, and the broken half in her hands began, impossibly, to knit itself toward wholeness, drawn by some old magic toward the other half that Cassian now held at the dais beside her. The two pieces straining toward each other like something long separated, finally allowed to remember its shape. The falcon dropped from the ruined rafters above and circled once over both their heads before settling on the stone between them, and the court, which had murmured and doubted and whispered for weeks, fell utterly silent. It was Lady Isadora who spoke first into that silence, stepping forward from the council seats with the composure that had guided the kingdom through a decade of quiet crises. She did not fight the verdict of the Falcon, and she did not offer some final, desperate objection to save the order she had built. Instead, she bowed formally and completely before Elowen, and declared to the assembled court that she had spent her life protecting the throne from division, and that she recognized, standing here, that the truest protection had arrived not as a threat, but as a mending. She asked only that she be permitted to continue serving the crown in whatever capacity it required of her, whether that meant council seat or quiet retirement, and she meant it because she understood, better than anyone present, that a kingdom held together by fear of the wrong thing was no kingdom worth protecting at all. Cassian granted her request without hesitation, naming her advisor to the new queen's household, and Isadora accepted with a dignity that silenced even the lords who had doubted Elowen most fiercely. Cassian turned to Elowen then, the mended crown resting whole between them for the first time in 3 generations, and he did not speak as a king issuing a proclamation. He spoke as a man who had watched a servant girl carry more grace through humiliation than most of his court had carried through comfort. And he asked her, in front of everyone who had once refused to see her, whether she would stand beside him, not because an old law demanded it, but because he wanted no other queen beside him for the rest of his reign. Elawyn, who had spent her whole life being told what she was allowed to want, found the answer rising in her without hesitation, and she said yes, her voice steady in a courtyard that had once made her feel as small as dust. The falcon lifted into the darkening sky above them, crying out once more before it vanished over the palace walls, as though its long watch had finally, quietly, ended. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who loves a slow burn worth waiting for, and tell me in the comments, did you see this ending coming?